that note, I have the distinct honor of introducing Senator Alexander. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken, for the good introduction. He mentioned my small town roots, which continually reminds me of why I still need a good introduction. I was driving home along what the legislature named the Lamar Alexander Parkway a few years ago after my election to the Senate, and I had nothing to eat for breakfast the next morning, so I stopped at the 7-Eleven to get a little stuff, and I put it on the counter, the milk, the bacon, and the eggs, and I had no cash. So I reached in my pocket and pulled out my credit card and handed it to the little girl behind the counter, and she looked at it and she said, "May I ask you a question?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Was you named after this road?" So Ken, thank you for the introduction. Thanks to Hudson for doing this. This is a real treat, and Checker and I are delighted that you sponsored the project to begin with 15 years ago, and we had a good forum about it and good discussion, and attracted tremendously talented authors for this little volume, The New Promise of American Life, and second to the panelists who are here today. I'm genuinely looking forward to staying and listening to the panelists, who are among the most distinguished thinkers in our country. So this is a treat for me, and I thank all of you for coming. A wise political candidate, like a good composer, listens for words and music that resonates with audiences and then repeats those phrases and melodies over and over again. Now, Chris DeMuth, who's here today, sent me a little note when he read that, and he said that the eminent British political philosopher Maurice Cranston said the best metaphor for political performance was theatrical performance, because the politician is acting a drama written by the audience himself. Well, whether it's the British philosopher or me comparing music and politics, we all listen for what resonates. And for phrases that resonated in the 2010 election, we might listen to the senators who were elected to hear what they said. Because in a year, and here's what we find out, in a year when the television screens displayed anger, these politicians often talked about hope. There were Rand Paul and Pat Toomey evangelizing about spreading free market prosperity instead of dwelling on government austerity. Rob Portman and Kelly Ayotte and Roy Blunt and Ron Johnson using their experience to describe ways to make it easier and cheaper to create private sector jobs, rather than just wringing their hands about 10% unemployment. And Marco Rubio affirming with his life's story America's exceptionalism instead of lamenting America's decline. To be sure, the issues that fired up the voters were about too much spending, too many taxes, too much debt, and too many Washington takeovers. But the senators who were elected to fix those problems are mostly American dreamers who believe in this country that anything still is possible for anyone who worked for it. Now, Europeans and others around the world find this to be an irrational view held by citizens in no other country. Yet most of American politics, and I think Samuel Huntington was the one who wrote this, most of American politics is about setting high goals and dealing with the disappointment of not meeting those goals and then trying again, such as all men are created equal, pay any price to defend freedom, no child left behind. This is not an enforced Americanism where the government in Washington tells you what to believe. It is a spontaneous patriotism of the kind you get from reading Lincoln's second inaugural address or the Oath of Allegiance that George Washington's men swore at Valley Forge in 1776, or David McCullough's book 1776, or attending Citizenship Day at a federal courthouse where new citizens from all over the world become Americans. The vitality of that dream is why Herbert Crowley's book, The Promise of American Life, written in 1909, a century ago, still is powerful today. The first chapter of Crowley's Progressive Manifesto could be read with enthusiasm at any tea party. But it is the rest of the book that we propose to discuss and dispute today. For in his remaining chapters, Crowley argues that for individuals to realize the promise of American life, the central government in Washington must play a much larger role. His book launched the progressive movement, featuring first President Wilson, and now President Obama. His is a strategy of made-in-Washington policies, grand schemes to solve big national problems based upon the assumption that these are things that individual Americans simply can't do for ourselves. In 1995, as Ken said, at the Hudson Institute's request, Checker Finn and I edited a book which we called The New Promise of American Life. Checker and I both then were fellows at Hudson, and I was touring the country hoping to persuade Americans that I was the logical choice for President of the United States. The public didn't agree with my logic, prompting my preacher brother-in-law to suggest that I should think of that political loss as a reverse calling. Our book was an attempt to provide some intellectual content for the anti-Washington fervor of the moment, that moment, a fervor that surges through American history. We chose the title The New Promise of American Life because we believed that progressivism had been carried too far and that what our country now needed was a reverse mirror image of Crowley's vision, or less from Washington and more of ourselves. Our idea of America was one created by states, operating community by community, depending upon civic virtue, valuing individual liberty, a nation simply too large and too diverse to be managed successfully by an all-knowing central government in Washington, D.C. Speaking of phrases that resonate, and I remember that Bill Kristol liked this one, my best political one-liner at the time was, "Cut their pay and send them home," referring to Congress, which made few friends in the world's greatest deliberative body in which I now serve. Reading what we published 15 years ago, I was impressed with the prescience of the essays from Bill Kristol and Paul Weyrich and Howard Baker and David Absher and Francis Fukuyama, William Shambra, Diane Ravitch, and others. Their advice resonates as well today as it did then. Reading their advice also reminds me of how little of that advice anyone took. Republicans who were elected in 1994 on the cry of no more unfunded federal mandates soon were promulgating conservative big government rules to replace liberal big government rules. Since 1995, the size of the federal budget has grown 140%, and the federal debt is up from $5 to $14 trillion. Within the last 2 years, the Progressive Solution Symphony has been playing in Washington again, reaching a new crescendo with budgets that double in 5 years and triple in 10, with government bailouts. And as one blogger has suggested, I think Bill Shambra found this, the appointment of more new czars and czarinas than even the Romanovs imagined. Seeing the inevitable anti-Washington surge rising again to counter the excesses of progressivism, I suggested to Checker about 6 weeks ago, we asked Hudson to revisit our 1995 book, and this form is the result of that suggestion. And after what I have to say, we'll hear from a distinguished panel that includes 3 contributors from the 1995 volume, Checker Finn, Bill Kristol, William Shambra, as well as from Chris DeMuth and Kate O'Byrne. Our hope is the same today as it was 15 years ago, to provide an intellectual context for the latest anti-Washington surge, with the additional hope that this time more elected officials actually listen to it and act on our advice. So let me begin the discussion. Let me make a single suggestion that I've made before, and that is that the new Congress should proceed step by step in the right direction to solve problems in a way that re-earns the trust of the American people, rather than invent comprehensive conservative big government schemes in an attempt to correct comprehensive liberal big government schemes. To make this point, I thought of hanging up in the Republican cloakroom photographs of Nancy Pelosi and Henry Waxman, because they symbolize what the federal government has done wrong over the last 2 years, not just to head in the wrong direction, but to try to get there all at once. This has been the government by taking big bites out of several apples and trying to swallow them at the same time, which has had the effect of enraging Republicans and terrifying the independent voters of America. During the recent health care debate, I heard a number of times from Democrats on the other side of the aisle this question: well, what are Republicans for? My answer was that if Democrats were waiting for the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, to roll into the Senate a wheelbarrow filled with a 2,700-page Republican comprehensive health care bill, they would be waiting for a long time. Or for that matter, a Republican version of a 1,200-page climate change bill or an 800-page immigration bill. Congressional action on comprehensive climate change, comprehensive immigration, and comprehensive health care have been well intended, but the first two fell of their own weight, and the health care law has been subject to multiple efforts to repeal it since the day it passed the Senate a year ago on Christmas Eve in a driving snowstorm. What has united almost all Republicans and a majority of Americans against these bills has been not only ideology, but also that they were comprehensive. I mean, as George Will might write, Congress does not do comprehensive well. Two recent articles help to explain the trouble with the Democratic comprehensive approach. The first, which appeared in National Affairs, was written by one of our panelists today, William Schambra, who explained that the, quote, sheer ambition of President Obama's legislative agenda as the approach of what Mr. Schambra called a policy president. He wrote that the president and most of his advisors have been trained at elite universities to govern by launching a host of enormous initiatives all at once, formulating comprehensive policies aimed at giving large social systems, and indeed society itself, more rational and coherent forms and functions. That was Mr. Schambra. Or in the terms of today's forums, this is the latest outburst of Crowleyism or progressivism. Mr. Schambra notes that the other most prominent organization feature of this Obama administration is its reliance on czars and czarinas to manage broad areas of policy. In this view, systemic problems of health care, of energy, of education, and of the environment simply can't be solved in pieces. Analyzing Mr. Schambra's article, David Broder of the Washington Post wrote this, quote, historically, that approach hasn't worked. The progressives failed to gain more than a brief ascendancy, and the Carter and Clinton presidencies were marked by striking policy failures, unquote. The reason for these failures, as Broder paraphrased Schambra, is that, quote, this highly rational, comprehensive approach fits uncomfortably with the Constitution, which apportions powers among so many different players. Broder then adds this: democracy and representative government are a lot messier than the progressives and their heirs, including Obama, want to admit. In a memorial essay involving or honoring Irving Kristol, Bill's father, in the Wall Street Journal last year, James Q. Wilson wrote that the law of unintended consequences is what causes the failure of such comprehensive legislative schemes. Explains Wilson, quote, launch a big project and you'll almost surely discover that you've created many things you didn't intend to create. The latest example, that's the end of Mr. Wilson's quote, the latest example of the truth of Mr. Wilson's observation can be seen by anyone watching the new health care law increase premiums, add to the federal debt, cause millions of individual policyholders to lose their policies, cause businesses to postpone adding new jobs, and inflict huge unfunded Medicaid mandates on states, all consequences the sponsors of the law strenuously argued never were intended, although I have to say they were predicted by Republicans. James Q. Wilson also wrote that neoconservatism, as Irving Kristol originally conceived of it in the 60s, was not an organized ideology or even necessarily conservative, but, quote, a way of thinking about politics rather than a set of principles and rules. It would have been better if we had been called policy skeptics, he said. Well, this skepticism of Schambra and Wilson and Kristol toward grand legislative policy schemes helps to explain how during the 2010 election, the law of unintended consequences made being a member of the so-called Party of No a more electable choice than being a member of the Party of Yes, We Can. James Q. Wilson also wrote in his essay that respect for the law of unintended consequences is, quote, not an argument for doing nothing, but it is one, in my view, he said, for doing things experimentally. Try the idea out in one place and see what happens. before you inflict it on the whole country. That is why if the Republican Party aspires to be a governing party rather than merely an ideological debating society, the question must still be, what are Republicans for? And the question has to be answered. If you'll examine the congressional record, you'll find we've been trying. You'll find that Republican senators tried to answer the question by following Mr. Wilson's advice, proposing a step-by-step approach to confronting our nation's health care and other challenges 173 times on the floor of the Senate during 2009. On health care, for example, we first suggested setting a clear goal, and that would be reducing Americans' costs, health care costs, so that more of us could afford to buy insurance. And then we proposed the first 6 steps toward that goal. 1, allowing small businesses to pool their resources to buy health care plans. 2, reducing junk lawsuits against doctors. 3, allowing the purchase of insurance across state lines. 4, expanding health savings accounts. 5, promoting wellness and prevention. 6, taking steps to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. There could be many more such steps, but we offered those 6 proposals in complete legislative text, totaling 182 pages for the 6 steps. The Democratic majority ridiculed the approach as, quote, piecemeal, in part because our approach was not comprehensive. Or take another example. In July of 2009, all 40 Republican senators announced agreement on 4 steps to produce low-cost clean energy, create the environment for 100 new nuclear plants, electrify half our cars and trucks over a long time, explore offshore for natural gas and oil, and double energy research and development for new forms of clean energy. This step-by-step Republican clean energy plan was an alternative to the Kerry-Boxer national energy tax that it would have imposed an economy-wide cap-and-trade scheme, driving jobs overseas looking for cheap energy and collecting hundreds of billions of dollars each year for a slush fund with which Congress could play. Now here's still another example, a bipartisan one. In 2005, a bipartisan group of us in Congress asked the national academies to identify the first 10 steps Congress should take to preserve America's competitive advantage so we could keep growing jobs. The academies appointed a distinguished panel. They recommended 20 steps. Congress enacted 2/3 of them. We call it the America Competes Act of 2007. It was important legislation, but it took on a big problem, but it was fashioned step by step. This style of governing squares with my experience as governor of Tennessee during the 80s. My goal was raise family incomes. Our state was the 3rd poorest state then. But I found as I went along that the best way to do that was step by step. Some steps larger, some smaller, such as changing banking laws, defending the right to work, keeping debt and taxes low, recruiting Japanese industry, then the auto industry, but also building 4-lane highways so that suppliers could get their parts to the auto plants just in time, and then a 10-step better schools program, one of which was to make our state the first to pay teachers more for teaching well. I didn't try to turn the whole state upside down at once, but working with leaders of both parties, I did help change it and grow step by step. And after a few years, we became the fastest growing state in family incomes. So what does this approach and these examples have to suggest to Republicans as we look to the new session of Congress? Now, as a result of the 2010 elections, we clearly have enough clout to stop risky, comprehensive schemes featuring more taxes, more debt, more Washington takeovers, and more hidden and unexpected surprises. And we have enough clout, too, to suggest alternative approaches for the most urgent problems of the day. In fact, we have an obligation to do so if we want to be able to persuade independent voters, as well as Republicans, that we ought to be the governing party in America after 2012. It's no mystery what our focus should be: jobs, debt, terror. Jobs and debt dominated the 2010 election. So applying the step-by-step rather than comprehensive approach to our first goal, it should be to make it easier and cheaper to create private sector jobs. Make it easier and cheaper to create private sector jobs. And you can make your list. I can make mine. A quick list of such steps comes to my mind. Don't raise taxes on anybody in the middle of an economic downturn. We're having a discussion about that in Congress this weekend. Repeal one by one the mandates on job creators in the health care law. Reduce the corporate tax rate. Reduce or eliminate the capital gains tax. Defend the secret ballot in union elections. Defend states' ability to protect right to work. Create the environment for 100 new nuclear plants. Double R&D for clean energy. Build a first-class transportation system. Repeal the so-called Consumer Protection Agency in the financial regulation law. Enact Korea, Colombia, and Panama free trade laws. All of these are steps toward making it easier and cheaper to create private sector jobs. I would add repeal the health care law entirely, although this might seem to be a comprehensive act, violating the Wilson-Kristol-Schambra step-by-step doctrine. Such a comprehensive undoing carries the risk of scaring independents. But as a practical matter, there's no other good way to deal with that historic mistake other than by repealing and replacing it with a step-by-step approach to reduce health care costs. In addition, most of the provisions don't take effect until 2014. The same step-by-step approach can be applied to the second goal, making the annual spending come as close to revenues as possible. Trying to eliminate the annual deficit in 1 year would turn the nation upside down. It's at points like this that photographs of Pelosi and Waxman in the cloakroom become useful. But for a nation that's borrowing 42 cents of every dollar to wait 1 day to begin to address its debt is suicidal. So there are steps that can and should be taken immediately while larger steps are being fashioned, such as step one could be no new entitlement automatic spending programs. In other words, don't dig the hole any deeper. President Obama's budget would shift $500 billion in Pell Grant spending over 10 years to mandatory spending. No more unfunded federal mandates on state and local governments. The Democratic governor of Tennessee, which has a $1.5 billion revenue shortfall this year, estimates the new health care law will impose $1.1 billion in unfunded Medicaid mandates on just our state between 2014 and 2019. Caps on discretionary spending. These dollars add up. Take the $500 billion in Medicare savings that the new health care law spent on new entitlement programs and use it to make Medicare solvent. Adopt a 2-year budget. This would allow Congress to spend every other year on oversight, repealing, and revising laws and regulations that are out of date and wasteful. Give the rest of the government's General Motors stock to every American who paid federal income taxes last April. That's the best way to get the government out of the automobile business. I also support a 2-year earmark ban. Earmarks have become a symbol of wasteful Washington spending. There are too many of them, and too many are for less than worthy purposes. But the process needs to be cleaned up. But this is more about good government than about saving money, since even unworthy projects are paid for by reducing spending in other parts of the budget. And long term, an earmark ban turns the checkbook over to the president at a time when most Americans voted for a check on the presidency. 15 years ago, Republicans captured control of Congress during one of those recurring outbursts when American voters announced that they wanted less of Washington and more freedom for themselves. That advice was not well heeded, and now we find ourselves again the political beneficiaries of another such outburst, and we have an opportunity to lay the groundwork to be a governing party within 2 years. My hope is that this time Republicans heed the advice of Wilson, Schambra, Kristol, that rather than attempt comprehensive conservative schemes, we keep our eye on the goals that matter most, make it easier and cheaper to create private sector jobs, reduce spending closer to revenues, and dealing in a tough strategic way with terrorism. And then we proceed step by step toward those goals in a way that re-earns the trust of the American people. We should give Herbert Crowley credit for reminding us in 1909, in the first chapter of his Promise of American Life, that this still is the one country in the world where most people believe that anything is possible and that anyone can succeed if he or she works hard. This is a country still, whether your grandfather can tell you, as mine did, aim for the top, there's more room there, and really believe it. Hopefully, Republicans who were elected in 2010 will follow their instinct not just to oppose the excesses of Crowley's progressivism, but to offer a new promise of American life, as we tried to do 15 years ago. Hopefully, they will continue to remind Americans that this debate is not some dry, dusty analysis, but a contest of competing governing philosophies about how to realize the dream of an upstart, still new nation in which most people still believe that anything is possible. Our argument is that our country's exceptionalism is best realized by the largest number of Americans when we expect less of Washington and more of ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.